She was fired for arriving late after helping an elderly woman, but 5 hours later, the woman's son walked in. And he owned the entire restaurant. Quick question, where are you watching from? Drop your city in the comments and subscribe. This story has a surprise finale you need to see. The rain had transformed Manhattan's downtown streets into rivers of grey despair. Sarah Mitchell stood outside the entrance of Rosewood Restaurant, her uniform still tucked under her arm, her hands trembling, but not from the cold. She had made a choice 3 hours ago, standing at a crossroads between duty to an employer and duty to humanity. An elderly woman had stumbled on the sidewalk near the restaurant, her groceries spilling across the wet pavement, her body hitting the ground with a sickening thud. Everyone had walked past. Everyone except Sarah. She'd helped Mrs. Eleanor Chen to her feet, cleaned her scraped knees with tissues from her purse, walked her home to an apartment 7 blocks away, and made sure she was comfortable and safe before leaving. By the time Sarah returned to Rosewood, the manager was waiting by the door with a clipboard and a sneer. He didn't care about Mrs. Chen's bleeding knee or her frightened eyes. He cared about the fact that Sarah was 37 minutes late for her shift. And in the restaurant business, 37 minutes might as well be 37 hours. "You're fired," Marcus had said, not even looking at her properly. "Checks in the mail." Now, standing in the rain with no job, no prospects, and rent due in 6 days, Sarah felt the weight of her own naivety crushing down on her shoulders. She was 31 years old. She'd been working at Rosewood for 2 years, saving every penny she could, trying to claw her way towards something resembling stability. She had no degree, no connections, no family money to fall back on. Her mother had passed away 5 years ago, and her father had essentially abandoned the family when Sarah was 12. It was just her, alone in this vast, indifferent city, and now she was unemployed. The restaurant behind her glowed with warmth she would never share again. Through the windows, she could see the soft amber lighting, the elegant tables draped in white linen, the waiters moving with practiced grace. Rosewood was an expensive place, the kind where hedge fund managers celebrated divorces and tech entrepreneurs hosted business dinners. Sarah had always felt like an imposter there, serving people whose monthly clothing budget exceeded her annual salary. But she had needed the job, and she had been good at it. A man passed by her on the sidewalk, walking quickly, his expensive coat and Italian shoes splashing through the puddles without seeming to notice. He had the kind of face that suggested he'd never worried about anything in his life. Sharp features, confident stride, eyes that held the certainty of someone for whom the world had always arranged itself favorably. He disappeared into Rosewood's entrance, and Sarah thought about how different their lives must be. How he would go inside, sit at a table, order something expensive, and never think about the real cost of anything. He would never know what it felt like to wonder if you could make your paycheck stretch to cover rent and groceries both. Sarah turned away, pulling her thin jacket tighter around herself, and began walking toward the subway. The rain fell harder, and she didn't care anymore. Let it soak through her clothes. Let it wash away this terrible day. The city felt impossibly large and impossibly cold, indifferent to her suffering in the way only cities could be. She thought about her mother, who'd always told her that kindness was its own reward. Sarah had believed that once. She'd believed that doing the right thing mattered, that the universe kept track of good deeds and repaid them with good fortune. But her mother was gone, dead at 52 from complications of diabetes that they couldn't afford to treat properly. So much for kindness being rewarded. Tomorrow she would look for a new job, go through the humiliating process of updating her resume with limited experience, and try to convince some other restaurant manager that she was worth minimum wage and the occasional free meal. She'd have to explain the gap in her employment history, and they'd immediately assume she'd been fired for cause. Who would believe the truth? That she'd chosen helping a stranger over keeping her job? That she'd been naive enough to think that would matter to anyone? For tonight, she would go home to her small studio apartment in Queens, make tea with honey and lemon, and cry quietly so her downstairs neighbor wouldn't hear. She'd check her bank account and do the math again. Rent was $100 or $200, utilities another $150, food maybe another $300 if she was careful. She had $2,147 in savings. Without a job, she had less than 3 weeks before everything fell apart. James Hartford sat at his favorite table in Rosewood, the one with a view of the bar and the kitchen, where he could watch everything without seeming obvious about it. He liked to do this at least once a week, come to one of his restaurants unannounced and observe his staff. People performed differently when they knew the owner was watching, but they performed most authentically when they thought he was just another customer. It was one of the ways he'd built his empire, paying attention to details, understanding the human element of business, recognizing excellence where others saw only service. At 35 years old, James had accomplished more than most people could dream of. He'd inherited a struggling restaurant group from his father, 5 establishments that had been hemorrhaging money due to poor management and outdated concepts. In 7 years, he'd transformed them into some of Manhattan's most sought-after dining destinations. He'd expanded to 12 locations across 3 states, built a reputation for innovation and excellence, and become a regular feature in business magazines as one of the city's most successful self-made entrepreneurs. The designation self-made was a lie, of course, but it was a lie he'd worked hard to construct. The truth was that his father had left him the restaurants and a trust fund of $2 million, but James had genuinely earned everything beyond that. He'd invested wisely, taken calculated risks, and built something real from the foundation his father had provided. That was worth something, wasn't it? His phone buzzed on the table. A text from Victoria. "Still coming to the Waldorf Gala tomorrow night? I've told all my friends about you." Victoria Ashford was exactly the kind of woman he was supposed to be with. She came from old money, attended the right schools, knew the right people, and understood the social rules that governed people like them. They'd been dating for 3 months, and everyone kept asking when he'd propose. Victoria expected a proposal. Everyone expected a proposal. But when James looked at her across a dinner table, beautiful, poised, perfect, he felt a profound emptiness. She cared about his money, his connections, his place in society. No one seemed to care about him. He typed back, looking forward to it, and set the phone aside with a sigh. His server approached with impeccable timing, not the usual server assigned to his table. Someone new, James noted. "Good evening, sir. May I get you something to drink?" James ordered his usual, a vintage Bordeaux, and settled back in his chair. Through the window, he caught a glimpse of a woman walking away from the restaurant, her shoulders hunched against the rain. There was something about her posture that caught his attention. Resignation, despair, the weight of the world on shoulders too slender to carry it. He watched until she disappeared around the corner, and then he turned back to his menu. He would forget her by tomorrow. He always did, but he didn't. As the evening progressed and he sat through his meal, James found his attention returning to that glimpse of the woman in the rain. There had been something real about her, something desperate and genuine that cut through the artifice of his carefully constructed life. She wasn't trying to impress anyone. She wasn't performing. She was simply broken and honest about it. He spent the rest of the evening distracted, replaying the moment in his mind. The way her shoulders had curved inward, as if she was trying to make herself smaller, less visible. The way she'd walked with purpose despite her obvious devastation. Most people would have wallowed in despair, but she'd been moving toward something, toward a future, toward survival. There was nobility in that, James realized. There was strength. Later that night, Lying in bed in his luxury penthouse apartment, James thought about that woman and felt something shift in him, something uncomfortable and unsettling. He'd spent the entire evening at the Waldorf Gala being charming and successful and utterly hollow. He'd held Victoria's hand and smiled at her friends and talked about expansion plans and market potential. He'd made jokes that landed well, been praised for his vision and business acumen, but none of it had felt real. None of it had mattered. And the entire time he'd been thinking about a stranger whose name he would never know. A woman who'd chosen compassion over self-preservation. A woman who probably didn't even know that she'd already made more of an impact on his evening than anyone else at that gala full of important, influential people. What would it be like to know her? To understand what drove someone to make the choices she made? James lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling of his penthouse, feeling like he was on the precipice of something that would change everything if he let it. The next morning, Sarah's phone buzzed at 6:47 a.m. before her alarm even had a chance to ring. She ignored it, pulling the thin blanket over her head and trying to hold on to the dream she'd been having, something about her mother, something warm and safe. The phone buzzed again and again. Finally, at 7:02 a.m., she relented and checked her messages. Her heart nearly stopped. "Sarah, it's Eleanor Chen from yesterday. My son James owns Rosewood Restaurant. I've told him what you did for me. He wants to meet with you. Can you come by the restaurant at 2 p.m. today? He might have a job opportunity for you." Sarah read the message 3 times, each reading feeling more unreal than the last. Mrs. Chen had given her address to her son. The elegant man she'd seen walking into Rosewood last night, that had been James Hartford, the owner. She showered quickly, standing under the lukewarm spray and trying not to think about how much her water bill would be this month. She had 2 pairs of presentable pants and 3 blouses that didn't have stains or holes. She chose carefully, settling on black pants and a cream-colored blouse that her mother had bought her years ago. The fabric was soft and elegant, even if it was starting to pill slightly at the edges. The subway ride downtown felt like it took forever. Sarah stood in the crowded car, gripping a pole to steady herself as the train lurched and swayed. Around her, other people checked their phones, stared into space, lived their own lives that probably didn't involve existential panic about money and survival. She practiced different scenarios in her head. What if it was a test? What if he felt obligated to Mrs. Chen but didn't actually want to hire her? What if this was about something else entirely? What if she showed up and found out that Mrs. Chen had been mistaken about her son owning the restaurant? She'd seen enough movies and read enough romance novels to know that life didn't usually work out this way. People didn't just get second chances, especially not people like her. Good things didn't happen to people who couldn't even afford to see a doctor when they got sick. But then again, she had nothing to lose. She was already unemployed. She was already facing the possibility of losing her apartment within a month. What was one more rejection? At this point, she was numb to it. She'd been rejected by life so many times that rejection from a potential employer barely registered on her emotional Richter scale. Still, as she climbed out of the subway station and walked toward Rosewood, her heart was hammering in her chest. She paused 2 blocks away, hidden in the doorway of a closed bank, and tried to calm herself. She checked her reflection in the glass door. Her blouse was wrinkled from sitting in the humidity of the subway. Her hair, which she'd pinned up carefully that morning, was starting to escape from its pins. She looked desperate. She looked exactly like what she was. A woman with 3 weeks of savings left and no job prospects. James was in his office on the 3rd floor of Rosewood when his assistant, Patricia, buzzed to let him know that the young lady had arrived. He'd been expecting her. His mother had called him that morning, with the full story about the woman who'd helped her on the street, the one she'd told him about at dinner last night. He'd found it charming, the way his mother spoke about this stranger who'd shown her basic human decency. He'd been planning to write a check or offer some token gesture of gratitude. He hadn't been planning to meet her in person, but his mother had been insistent. Margaret Hartford was not a woman who took no for an answer. She'd shown up at his office at 8 a.m. with coffee and a determined expression, and she'd insisted that if he was going to help this woman, he should at least know her properly. "You owe her at least that much," Margaret had said cryptically, in a way that suggested she knew something he didn't. More importantly, his mother had figured out who the woman was and where she worked. She'd shown up at Rosewood that evening, described the waitress she'd spoken to, and James's heart had stopped. The woman from his dreams, the one he'd been thinking about constantly since he'd seen her in the rain, worked in his own restaurant. The universe had a strange sense of humor, and somehow, impossibly, James had realized it was the same woman he'd seen walking away in the rain, the one whose despair had briefly tugged at something in his chest before he'd pushed it aside, the one who'd been firing synapses in his brain all night, the one he knew he shouldn't be interested in, but desperately was. "Send her in," he said, trying to sound casual. The door opened, and Sarah walked in, and time did something strange. It slowed down, stretched out, became malleable. She was wearing a cream-colored blouse that made her skin look luminous, and her hair was pulled back in a neat bun that showed the fine angles of her face. She was nervous. He could see that in the way her hands clasped in front of her, in the way her eyes darted around the office before settling on him. She was beautiful. Not in the polished, manufactured way that Victoria was beautiful. She was beautiful in a way that suggested depth, struggle, resilience. "Mr. Hartford?" she said, her voice soft but steady. "Thank you for seeing me." James realized he'd been staring. He stood, extending his hand across the mahogany desk. "Miss Mitchell, is it? Please sit. My mother has told me quite a bit about you." The handshake lasted a fraction of a second longer than it should have. He noticed the calluses on her palm from years of holding heavy trays. He noticed the way her eyes widened slightly when their skin touched, and he felt an answering response in his own chest. A quickening, a sudden awareness that this meeting was going to change something. "Your mother is a wonderful woman," Sarah said, settling into the chair across from him. "I'm just glad I could help her." "You lost your job because you helped her," James said, knowing it would be a test. Sarah's chin lifted slightly. "Yes, but I'd do it again." And then that was when James Hartford, who had dated senators' daughters and real estate tycoons' nieces, who had a girlfriend who came from one of the oldest families in New England, who had carefully constructed every aspect of his life to avoid exactly this kind of complication. That was when he realized his life was about to become very complicated indeed. "I'm offering you a position as head server at Rosewood," James said, his voice carefully professional. "The position comes with benefits, health insurance, and a salary of $55,000 a year. You'd also be eligible for bonuses based on performance and customer satisfaction." Sarah's mouth opened and closed. $55,000. That was nearly double what she'd been making, and with a salary came stability, benefits, a future that didn't seem like it was hanging by a thread. "There's more," James continued. "I'm also opening a new restaurant in 2 months, a more casual concept, more neighborhood-focused. I'd like you to be part of the training and development team. If you're interested, there's potential for a management position within a year." "Why?" Sarah asked, and the question hung between them, loaded with more meaning than either of them acknowledged. "Because my mother clearly thinks you're an exceptional person. And because I saw the way you looked when you walked away from this restaurant yesterday, you deserved better than what happened to you." It was partly the truth. The rest of the truth, that he'd thought about her all night, that he'd imagined conversations with her, that he'd started wondering what it would be like to know her properly, that truth he kept to himself. "When would I start?" Sarah asked. "Tomorrow, if you're willing." She nodded, and James felt something in his chest settle, as if he'd been holding his breath without realizing it. Sarah's first week at Rosewood was a study in contrasts. On one hand, she was thrilled. The salary was real, the benefits were real, and for the first time in years, she could breathe without feeling like she was drowning. She'd walked into James's office expecting rejection and walked out with a job, benefits, health insurance, and a salary that had made her eyes water. In her tiny apartment that night, she'd sat on her bed and cried happy tears, something she hadn't done in years. She'd called every utility company to make sure her accounts were up to date. She'd paid her rent a week early, a luxury that felt almost obscene when she thought about how many weeks she'd been 1 month behind. She'd bought groceries without doing mental math on prices, choosing organic vegetables and actual protein instead of the ramen and canned beans that had been her staple. She'd even bought herself a small coffee from her favorite place without feeling guilty. A latte with an extra shot and a sprinkle of cinnamon, exactly the way she liked it. She'd held the cup in both hands and felt something shift in her chest. Maybe kindness mattered. Maybe the universe did keep track after all. On the other hand, she was acutely aware that she was working for James Hartford, and James Hartford seemed to be everywhere and nowhere all at once. She'd see him walking through the restaurant, stopping to speak with customers, checking in with the kitchen. He was different at work, more formal, more distant. But sometimes she'd catch him looking at her, and in those moments she'd feel something shift in the atmosphere, something electric and undefined. Over the following months, they fell into a pattern that would define their early relationship. After service, when the restaurant was quiet, they'd sit at their favorite corner table and talk. They talked about books and music, about life and dreams and regrets. Sarah learned that James played piano, though he hadn't in years. James learned that Sarah was taking online classes toward a psychology degree, squeezing them in between her shifts and work. One night in July, 2 months after Sarah had been hired, James told her about Victoria. They were sitting at their corner table after service had ended, the restaurant quiet and intimate around them. "I've been dating her for 6 months now," he said, and there was guilt in his voice. "Everyone expects us to get married. Her family expects it. My mother expects it. But I can't stop thinking about—" He stopped himself, but the implication hung between them. "You can't," Sarah said, and her voice was firm. "James, you can't do this. You can't be thinking about someone else while you're in a relationship. That's not fair to her, and it's not fair to you." "I know," he said, and he looked miserable. "I know. But I can't help it. You're the most important person in my life, and I don't know how to untangle that." Sarah stood up, putting distance between them. "Then untangle it. Figure out what you actually want and be honest about it. Don't do to her what would have been done to you. Don't deceive her." "I'm going to end it," James said. "With Victoria. I'm going to end it, and then you need to wait," Sarah said. "You need to give yourself time to process, to heal, to figure out who you are without her. You don't jump from one relationship into another. That's just repeating the same pattern." James looked up at her, and there was frustration in his eyes, but also respect. "When did you become so wise?" "I'm not wise," Sarah said. "I'm just watching you and recognizing that I've made a lot of the same mistakes. I've settled for less than I deserved because I was desperate. I've been in situations because they seemed better than the alternative, not because they were actually what I wanted. I'm not going to watch you do that. I care about you too much." There was silence. The words, "I care about you," hung between them like something alive and dangerous. "I'm going to break up with Victoria," James said finally, "tomorrow. And then I'm going to ask you to have dinner with me, not as colleagues, not as people who talk after service. As a date, a real date. And if you say no, I'll accept it, and I'll try to be okay with just being in your life in whatever way you'll allow. But I have to try." Sarah wanted to say yes immediately. She wanted to throw caution to the wind and let herself feel what she'd been trying to suppress for weeks. But she'd learned something through her years of struggle, that wanting something desperately wasn't the same as it being right. "Ask me again," she said, "after you've ended things with Victoria. Not because I don't want to hear it now, but because I need to know that you're doing this for the right reasons. I need to know that you're choosing me, not just running away from her." James broke up with Victoria on a Thursday afternoon. It was as painless as these things can be. She'd cried, but they'd been tears of frustration rather than heartbreak. She'd actually said at one point, "There's someone else, isn't there?" And James had confirmed it, and she'd seemed almost relieved. On some level, she'd known. He'd been going through the motions for months. "She's not from our world, is she?" Victoria had asked, with a kind of clinical sadness. "No," James had said. "She's from the real world, the one where people actually mean what they say." On Friday evening, James waited by Sarah's table during her shift, watching her move through the restaurant with grace and efficiency. When service ended, he asked her to take a walk with him. They walked through the quiet streets of downtown Manhattan, the summer air warm around them, the city breathing around them like something alive. James took her to a small Italian restaurant that was closed to the public, but that he co-owned with a friend. They let him in after hours, set up a small table on the rooftop overlooking the city, and left them alone. "I ended things with Victoria," he said, once they were alone. "I should have done it months ago. But I was scared of change, scared of disrupting the life I'd built. It took meeting you to make me realize that the life I'd built was empty." Sarah listened, not interrupting. "I know I have a lot to figure out," he continued. "I know I come with complications, money, family expectations, my own damage, but I'm asking you to let me try. Not to fix me, not to complete me, but to let me build something real with you, something that matters." Sarah felt tears pricking her eyes. "I'm scared," she admitted. "I'm scared that this is too good to be true. I'm scared that when you really get to know me, you'll realize I'm just ordinary. I'm scared that I'll hold you back, that you'll resent me for not fitting into your world." "The world I was in before," James said, reaching across the table to take her hand, "wasn't actually my world. It was someone else's expectations that I'd put on like a costume. You're the first person who's made me feel like I could just be myself. Don't be scared of that. Be hopeful about it." And Sarah was. She let herself be hopeful. They stayed on that rooftop until after midnight, talking, laughing, occasionally kissing in the way of people who'd been waiting for permission to do it. By the time James walked her home to her apartment in Queens, both of them felt like they'd stepped into a different version of reality. One where love wasn't a luxury for people with resources, but something essential and real and worth building a life around. The weeks turned into months. Sarah's second week at Rosewood, she was trained by the head server position and quickly became one of the restaurant's best employees. She had a gift for reading customers, for anticipating their needs before they asked, for making each person who came through the door feel genuinely welcome. Customers started requesting her table specifically. Tips climbed. Her supervisor, Marcus, started mentioning her in his weekly reports, and James found himself inventing reasons to be at the restaurant on nights when he knew she'd be working. They fell into a pattern. After service, when the restaurant was quiet, they'd sit at that corner table and talk. Sarah learned that James played piano, though he hadn't in years. James learned that Sarah was taking online classes toward a psychology degree, squeezing them in between her shifts and work. They talked about their families, their fears, the ways they felt like imposters in their own lives. One night in late June, 2 months after Sarah had been hired, James told her about Victoria. "I've been dating her for 6 months now," he said, and there was guilt in his voice. "Everyone expects us to get married. Her family expects it. My mother expects it. But I can't stop thinking about—" He stopped himself, but the implication hung between them. You can't, Sarah said, and her voice was firm. James, you can't do this. You can't be thinking about someone else while you're in a relationship. That's not fair to her, and it's not fair to you. I know, he said, and he looked miserable. I know, but I can't help it. You're the most important person in my life, and I don't know how to untangle that. Sarah stood up, putting distance between them. Then untangle it. Figure out what you actually want and be honest about it. Don't do to her what would have been done to you. Don't deceive her. I'm going to end it, James said. With Victoria, I'm going to end it, and then you need to wait, Sarah said. You need to give yourself time to process, to heal, to figure out who you are without her. You don't jump from one relationship into another. That's just repeating the same pattern. James looked up at her, and there was frustration in his eyes, but also respect. When did you become so wise? I'm not wise, Sarah said. I'm just watching you and recognizing that I've made a lot of the same mistakes. I've settled for less than I deserved because I was desperate. I've been in situations because they seemed better than the alternative, not because they were actually what I wanted. I'm not going to watch you do that. I care about you too much. Sarah felt tears pricking her eyes as she heard the words come out of her own mouth. She did care about him, dangerously, desperately, completely, the kind of caring that could destroy her if it wasn't returned, the kind of caring that meant she had everything to lose now. I'm going to break up with Victoria, James said finally, tomorrow, and then I'm going to ask you to have dinner with me, not as colleagues, not as people who talk after service, as a date, a real date. And if you say no, I'll accept it, and I'll try to be okay with just being in your life in whatever way you'll allow. But I have to try. Sarah wanted to say yes immediately. She wanted to throw caution to the wind and let herself feel what she'd been trying to suppress for weeks. But she'd learned something through her years of struggle, that wanting something desperately wasn't the same as it being right. Ask me again, she said, after you've ended things with Victoria. Not because I don't want to hear it now, but because I need to know that you're doing this for the right reasons. I need to know that you're choosing me, not just running away from her. Over the following days, Sarah felt the weight of what was happening settle on her shoulders. The other staff members at Rosewood had noticed the connection between her and James, the way his eyes followed her across the dining room, the way her cheeks flushed when he appeared. The whispers started immediately. Gold digger, social climber. She'd seduced her way into her job. David, one of the other servers, pulled her aside one afternoon during prep. Don't let them get to you, he said quietly. People always assume the worst about women who date men with money. But I've worked here long enough to know that James is different. If he's interested in you, it's because he genuinely sees something in you. Not everyone is as shallow as they seem. But the words didn't fully comfort her. She'd spent her whole life feeling like she didn't belong, and now she had evidence that she might have been right. People didn't see her for who she was. They saw the girl from the wrong side of the tracks who'd landed a rich man, and they'd built their entire narrative around that assumption. One night, after service, when she mentioned it to James as they walked to his apartment in Soho, he stopped walking and turned to face her. I hear the things people say, she told him, about how I must have pursued you or seduced you to get my job, about how I don't deserve any of this. James stopped walking and turned to face her. Do you believe that? I don't know, Sarah admitted. Part of me does. Part of me still feels like I'm waiting for the other shoe to drop, for you to realize I'm not actually the person you think I am. You are exactly who I think you are, James said fiercely. You're the strongest, most genuine person I've ever met. You helped my mother when it cost you your job. You're building a future through night classes and hard work. You don't take shortcuts or compromise your principles. That's who you are. And if people can't see that, it says more about them than about you. He pulled her close on the corner of their street, not caring who saw them, and kissed her with enough passion to make her believe, at least for a moment, that he meant every word. In August, James took Sarah to meet his family properly. Not just his mother, whom she'd already grown close to, but his extended family, his cousins, his uncle, the whole Hartford dynasty. They spent a weekend at the family's house in the Hamptons, a sprawling Victorian mansion that had been in the family for 4 generations. Sarah wore the nicest dress she owned, which was still practically from a department store sale rack compared to the clothes the rest of the family wore. She felt conspicuously out of place, like she'd wandered onto a movie set and hadn't realized it yet. James's aunt, Victoria's mother's best friend, took one look at her and said, "Oh, well, you're younger than I expected," his cousin Richard asked her within the first 5 minutes of meeting her. "So, what does your father do?" And when she said he was a musician, when he was around, Richard had let out a small, knowing laugh, as if she'd just confirmed his suspicions about her unsuitability. But his mother, Margaret, was warm and welcoming. She pulled Sarah aside the next afternoon and said, "Don't listen to them. They're scared. James is the most successful one in our family in a generation, and they're afraid of losing influence over him. You represent independence, and that frightens them." "Does it frighten you?" Sarah asked. Margaret smiled. "Not at all. I'm delighted. I've been watching my son turn into someone I didn't recognize, someone cold and calculated and determined to build an empire instead of a life. Then you came along, and suddenly he started talking about taking vacations and going to museums. He played piano last week, which he hasn't done in 5 years. You're good for him. That's all that matters." That evening, sitting in the garden with Margaret, Sarah found herself asking the question that had been eating at her for weeks. "Do you think people will always assume I'm with him for his money? That I don't deserve what I have?" Margaret considered this carefully, reaching over to pour them both glasses of wine. The garden was beautiful at dusk, flowers blooming in shades of pink and purple, the ocean visible in the distance, the sound of crickets creating a gentle soundtrack to their conversation. "I think some people always will," Margaret said finally, her voice thoughtful and kind. "People are threatened by things they don't understand. They'll spend their whole lives assuming the worst about other people, rather than considering the possibility that love might actually be real, that someone might actually value another person regardless of their bank account. But you can't control what other people think. You can only control what you know to be true. And you know that you're in this relationship because you genuinely love my son, and because he makes you want to be the best version of yourself. That's what matters." She paused, taking a sip of wine, then continued. "You know what I saw when James was young? A boy so determined to be worthy of his inheritance that he forgot to be worthy of himself. He built an empire because he thought that was what love looked like: ambition, success, status. But then you came along, and suddenly he's talking about meaningful work. He's asking questions about his life that have nothing to do with profit margins. He's remembering who he was before he decided he needed to become someone else. That's what love does. It shows us our true selves." Sarah felt tears pricking her eyes. No one had ever validated her feelings like that before, as if they were real and legitimate and worth protecting. Margaret squeezed her hand gently, and Sarah understood that she had found something rare, a woman who saw her for who she actually was and chose to love her anyway. September brought a crisis, the kind that no one sees coming. James received a call from his accountant one morning, and Sarah watched his face drain of color as he listened. "What's happened?" she asked as soon as he hung up. "There's been an issue with one of the restaurants," James said slowly. "Brooklyn location. The manager has apparently been embezzling for months, thousands of dollars. The accountant just discovered it during a routine audit." Sarah felt her chest tighten. How much? $84,000, James said. Over the course of 6 months, he was using the manager account to process fake refunds and payment adjustments. The guy's been with the company for 5 years. I trusted him completely. That's not your fault, Sarah said, moving to sit beside him. It is, James said flatly. I'm the owner. It's my responsibility to have systems in place to catch this kind of thing. I was too trusting, too naive. I wanted to believe that if I treated my employees well, they'd be loyal. Over the next week, the situation unfolded like a carefully constructed tragedy. The manager, a man named David Summers, had been diagnosed with gambling addiction about a year prior. His daughter had gotten sick, needed expensive treatment not covered by insurance. He'd been desperate, and the embezzlement had started as a way to pay for her care. By the time his daughter had gotten better, he'd become addicted to the money itself, to the feeling of having control over something. James could have prosecuted. He had every legal right. Instead, he sat down with David in his office and did something unexpected. I'm not going to press charges, he said, and Sarah was there because James had asked her to be, needed her presence like an anchor. But you're going to pay back every penny you stole, and you're going to get help for your gambling addiction. I'm going to put you on an unpaid leave of absence for 3 months, during which time you'll go to rehabilitation. If you successfully complete the program and are genuinely committed to recovery, I'll consider rehiring you in a different position, with systems in place to prevent anything like this from happening again. David had wept. He'd kept saying, I don't deserve this, I don't deserve forgiveness. No, James had agreed, you don't. But I'm offering it anyway because I believe in second chances, because I've been in situations where I've made mistakes that hurt people I cared about, and I hope someone would offer me the same kindness. After David left, James had fallen apart. Sarah had held him while he cried, great heaving sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside him, somewhere that had been holding tension for far too long. She'd led him to the sofa in his office, loosened his tie, and simply held him while the weight of his own goodness crushed him. He'd always believed that if he treated people well, they'd reflect that kindness back to him. It was a naive belief, he realized. The world didn't work on that kind of cosmic ledger. People were complicated. They made mistakes. They gave in to their weaknesses. And his role as their employer didn't give him the right to judge them for their humanity. I'm sorry, he kept saying. I'm sorry. I brought you into this complicated mess. You deserved better than to watch someone you care about get betrayed like this. I'm here because I choose to be, Sarah said firmly, running her hands through his hair, trying to soothe him the way her mother had soothed her when she was a child. I'm here because I love you. Not James Hartford, the millionaire, not James Hartford, the successful businessman. I love you, the person who cries when he realizes his kindness has been taken advantage of, who cares so much about his employees that he can't imagine them betraying him. That's who I love. That's the person I want to build a life with. And in that moment, as she held him while he fell apart, Sarah understood something profound. Love wasn't about finding someone perfect. Love was about finding someone whose imperfections matched your own, someone whose damage complemented yours, someone whose tears you wanted to wipe away with your own trembling hands. By October, the crisis had passed. David had completed his rehabilitation program. James had enhanced his accounting procedures, and life had returned to something resembling normal. But something had shifted in James's perspective. He called Sarah into his office one evening in mid-October. I want to change careers, he said without preamble. Sarah blinked. What? I want to get out of the restaurant business, he said. I love creating spaces where people can gather, but I don't love the business side of it anymore. I don't love the constant pressure to expand, to maximize profit, to turn human experiences into revenue streams. I want to do something more meaningful. What kind of something? Sarah asked carefully. I'm thinking about selling the restaurants, James said. All of them. I've been offered a substantial price by a larger group. They want the brand, the locations, the systems I've built. It would be enough to live comfortably for the rest of my life, more than enough, and then I could do something different, something that actually matters. He paused, then continued, like starting a scholarship fund for kids whose parents aren't wealthy, like going back to school myself, maybe studying sustainable business practices, like working with non-profits to create food-based social services, like actually helping people instead of just extracting profit from their desire to have a nice dinner. He paused, then continued, I know this affects you, your job, your future. I want to do this in a way that doesn't destabilize your life. But I also need to know, would you support this? Could you be with someone who's making this choice? Sarah thought about how she'd felt when she'd lost her job at Rosewood. She'd thought her life was over. Then James had given her an opportunity, and she'd built something real from it. She'd started going to school. She'd made plans for a future that involved more than just survival. Yes, she said, I support this completely. And you know what? I'm going to support you by finishing my degree and getting a job in social services. So when you do start your non-profit, you won't have to hire a stranger. You'll have me. James pulled her up from her chair and kissed her. And in that moment, Sarah felt something shift in her understanding of what a partnership could be. It wasn't about one person supporting the other. It was about two people building something together, each making the other braver. The sale of the restaurants took 3 months to finalize. By January, James had signed the papers, received a check that made Sarah's head spin when she saw the number, and officially stepped away from his life as a restaurant mogul. The transition period was strange. James was relieved to be out of the day-to-day grind, but he was also slightly lost, the way people sometimes are when they remove a defining aspect of their identity. Sarah suggested a trip, something neither of them had much experience with, given their very different financial histories. They went to Peru for 2 weeks in February, staying in a small bed and breakfast in the Sacred Valley, spending their days exploring Incan ruins and sitting in local markets, talking to vendors about their lives and livelihoods. On their last night in the valley, sitting under stars so thick they seemed unreal, James asked Sarah to marry him. He didn't have a ring. He'd wanted to choose one with her, but he got down on one knee in the dusty street of the small village they were staying in, and he asked, and Sarah said yes without hesitation. They called Margaret the next morning. She cried happy tears and immediately started planning what she called something intimate but elegant, definitely at the house in the Hamptons. Sarah's father, hearing about the engagement through a mutual acquaintance, reached out for the first time in years. Sarah almost didn't respond, but James encouraged her to. Maybe he'd changed. Maybe he deserved a second chance the way David had. So they had a complicated dinner where her father apologized for years of absence and promised to do better, and Sarah decided to cautiously believe him. The wedding was in May, exactly 1 year after Sarah had been fired from Rosewood for helping an old woman. It was small, only 75 guests, but it was beautiful. Sarah wore a simple dress that she'd chosen because it felt like her, not because it was trendy or expensive. James's suit was tailored to perfection, but he wore it with a relaxed confidence that suggested he no longer felt like he needed to prove anything to anyone. Margaret walked Sarah down the aisle because her father had gotten sick at the last minute and couldn't travel. Eleanor Chen, James's mother, sat in the front row and cried quietly into a handkerchief. The ceremony itself was brief and genuine. No religious elements, no traditional vows written by other people. Just James and Sarah standing in front of everyone they cared about, saying their own promises to each other. "I promise to see you," James said, his voice steady, "not as a project to fix or a girl from the wrong side of the tracks, but as the person you actually are, complex and brave and wholly yourself." I promise to build a life with you that's based on honesty and partnership, where we challenge each other to be better, not because we're afraid of falling short, but because we genuinely want to grow. I promise to trust you, Sarah said, her voice shaking slightly, not just with my heart, but with my future. I promise to let you support me, to accept help without feeling like I have to prove my worth to deserve it. And I promise to always remember that kindness matters, that stopping to help someone when they're in need is worth any cost. That's what brought us together, and I never want to forget that. They exchanged rings, simple gold bands engraved with the date, nothing more. And when James kissed her, the gathered crowd erupted in cheers. The reception was held in a garden overlooking the ocean. There was excellent food. James had consulted with several chefs on the menu, and dancing and toasts from his mother and David, the manager James had chosen to rehire. David spoke about second chances and what it meant to believe in someone even when they'd failed you. The honeymoon took them through Europe, 3 weeks of trains and small hotels, and finding themselves in a world that didn't care about their socio-economic status or their past. They were just two people in love, navigating a new marriage together. When they returned to New York, James's non-profit foundation was in its early stages. He'd recruited a board of directors that included economists, social workers, and business professionals. The plan was to focus on 3 areas: providing scholarships to disadvantaged high school students, funding career training programs for adults in poverty, and supporting food-based social services in underserved communities. Sarah worked as an administrative coordinator while finishing her degree. She'd discovered a gift for understanding people's circumstances and connecting them with resources. Her colleagues said she had a rare ability to see past someone's circumstances to their potential. The truth was that she understood what it felt like to be invisible, to be underestimated, to be desperate. That understanding made her good at her job. 3 months into their marriage, Sarah discovered she was pregnant. She hadn't planned it. They'd been using protection, but apparently nothing is 100% reliable. Her first instinct was panic. They'd just gotten married. James had just changed careers. She was in the middle of her education. But James, when she told him, simply smiled and pulled her close. "A baby," he said wonderingly. "We're going to have a baby." "I know," Sarah said, searching his face for signs of regret or fear. "I know this wasn't the plan. The best things usually aren't," James said. "Life doesn't follow plans. It just happens, and we decide how to respond. I respond to this by being absolutely thrilled." Sarah gave birth to a daughter in March, a beautiful girl with her father's coloring and her mother's fierce determination. They named her Eleanor, after the woman whose kindness Sarah had returned that grey afternoon 1.5 years ago. Margaret cried when she heard the name. Eleanor Chen brought a gift to the hospital, a small silver charm shaped like a guardian angel. "Because that's what you are," she told Sarah, "an angel. You saved my life that day even though it cost you, and in saving my life, you saved my son's too. You gave him back his humanity." Sarah held her daughter and felt the full weight of what her life had become. She was a mother now. She was married to a man who loved her completely. She was building a career that mattered. She was safe. She was secure. She was home. She thought about her mother, whom she'd lost so young. She wondered what her mother would think if she could see Sarah now, with a baby of her own, with a man who genuinely treasured her, with a life that had become everything she'd ever dreamed of when she was drowning in despair. Over the next 5 years, Sarah finished her degree and became the executive director of James's foundation, overseeing programs that helped thousands of people gain access to education and resources. James served on the board and wrote extensively about sustainable business practices and social responsibility. Eleanor grew into a bright, empathetic child who asked constantly about why some people had more than others and how she could help make things fair. They had another child, a son named David, after the manager James had believed in when no one else would. They bought a brownstone in Brooklyn, not because it was fashionable or expensive, but because it felt like home. They made dinner with local ingredients, knowing exactly where the food had come from. They volunteered at the non-profit on weekends, teaching classes about money management and financial literacy to communities who desperately needed that information. One evening, 5 years after they'd met, James and Sarah returned to Rosewood Restaurant. It was no longer theirs. The new owners had made changes, modernized it, but it was still beautiful. They sat at their corner table, the one where they'd had so many conversations in the quiet hours after service. "I've been thinking about something," Sarah said, absently touching the wedding ring James had given her. "Remember that first night we sat here, when I'd just lost my job?" "Of course," James said. "I knew even then that you were different, that you mattered in a way other people didn't." "I've been reading about Mrs. Eleanor Chen's medical bills," Sarah continued. "From that day when I helped her, I want to create a fund in her name for elderly people in our community who need medical care but can't afford it." James reached across the table and took her hand. "I think that's a beautiful idea." "I know it's not about us," Sarah added. "I know the point isn't to erase the struggle or pretend that one act of kindness fixed everything. The point is to make sure that the next person doesn't have to choose between doing the right thing and losing everything." "That is the point," James agreed. "That's always been the point." They sat together in comfortable silence, holding hands across the table where their story had truly begun. Outside, the city moved and breathed and continued on, full of people struggling with their own versions of despair and hope. But inside, in their corner of warmth and light, two people who'd found each other against all odds were building a life that meant something. It wasn't a fairy tale exactly. Fairy tales are too neat, too simple. But it was real, and for people who'd spent so long feeling invisible and unworthy, real was everything.